Hello everyone, welcome to our discussion today on the Reformation. It's an important part of the Renaissance, not usually conceived as part of the Renaissance, but it has a Renaissance feeling to it of humanism and of a reversion to older times. In this case, not ancient Greek and Roman society, but that early Christian society that developed in the latter part of the Roman Empire. To really understand the Reformation, we need to begin with an examination of the Catholic Church in the 15th century. There was tremendous corruption. The Catholic Church had just recovered from a split, actually a move to Avignon, France as the headquarters of the church, and then a split between popes in Avignon and in Rome. And for several years, there was a split throughout Europe, some supporting the Avignon Pope and some supporting the Roman Pope. And eventually that divide between the church, the split, sometimes called the schism, was healed, and Rome was reestablished as the headquarters of the Catholic Church. But in the meantime, during the time that the headquarters was in Avignon, Rome had become a decayed city. There were actually animals that were housed in some of the churches, and churches were falling into terrible disrepair. Other buildings associated with the Catholic Church were in near ruin. And in addition to that, the people who were in charge of the Catholic Church, not just the Pope, but the hierarchy in general, were quite corrupt, morally as well as politically. There was an attempt to try and unify the church, and that attempt was made, first of all, by an expulsion of heretics. Some typical examples would be Wycliffe, or Wycliffe, sometimes said, and Tyndale, who were in England. They were separated by about 200 years. And they were critical of the Pope and desirous of having an English language scriptures. Neither of those were approved by the Catholic Church. A similar argument was given by a man named Jan Hus in Bohemia, present-day Czech Republic. Jan Hus was actually burned at the stake for being a heretic. Tyndale was also killed, and Wycliffe was put in jail and didn't actually die as a martyr, but to show the church's disfavor with him, his bones were dug up and they were burnt. Therefore, this was a time of great difficulty for the Catholic Church, with heretics springing up to criticize the church. In addition to that, money was needed to try and rebuild Rome after this period of schism, and sometimes called the Babylonian captivity, when the headquarters was taken to Avignon. So one of the ways that the church desired to rebuild and get the money for rebuilding was the use of indulgence. Let's take a look at this video, and here in this video we can see the power of the indulgences and how much money they could bring in to the Catholic Church.
Pope Julius II had died. He was succeeded by Leo X. And Leo was a man devoted to the pleasures of the flesh. Within 2 years of sumptuous festivals and wild boar hunts, Leo had emptied the papal treasuries. He was forced to halt work on the church's greatest extravagance yet, the glorious Basilica of St. Peter's. Leo was unconcerned. To refill his treasuries, he turned to one of the church's most proven methods for raising money: selling indulgences, charging the faithful for entry into heaven.
This indulgence was basically a piece of paper sold for a very appropriate sum of money, incidentally adjusted to your means, which promised to pay the bearer on demand forgiveness of sins.
Leo's indulgence had a number of unique benefits. You could buy one not just for yourself, but also for your dead relatives. And it pardoned an astonishing array of sins. It was said that it would even forgive sexual intercourse with the Virgin Mary, had that been possible. Here was salvation in exchange for a sum. Leo made careful preparations for the issuing of his new indulgence. He brought in a Dominican friar called Johann Tetzel to handle the sales and PR. He had chosen well. Leo waited for his empty coffers to fill with the donations of the faithful.
In the midst of this confusion of the Catholic Church and problems in Rome, there was a young man studying at the university in Germany. His name was Martin Luther. And of course, he was a critical component of the Reformation. Martin Luther was originally studying law, but on his journey home after a year of study, or a couple of years, he was caught in a terrible thunder and lightning storm. And he was frightened. And Martin Luther said that if God would protect him and let him live through this terrible storm, he would dedicate his life to God. Martin Luther did live, and when he returned to school, he changed his major and became a monk. So he began to study theology. He not only became a monk, but he then became a doctor of theology, and he was an excellent teacher. He joined a monastery and had great self-doubts, lots of problems with his own life. He just was very introspective. He confessed many times a day. Very, very difficult period in Martin Luther's life. Not that he was an evil person, but he just felt so unworthy of God's grace that he couldn't come to terms with where he was in his own life. Eventually, he was given a position as a professor of the Bible at a relatively new university in the city of Wittenberg. And there, he was a very popular teacher. His order, that is his monk order, decided that they would send him on a trip to Rome, hoping that if he got into Rome and saw the church and its strength, that he would find himself and rise to be a better person and gain some self-confidence. So Martin Luther went down to Rome, but when he was there, he saw the corruption of the church. He saw the wholesale distribution of indulgences and other things that the church was doing that offended him. And so when he went back to Wittenberg, he began to think and stew and worry about the problems that he encountered. The first problem was the indulgences. He thought that they were inappropriate. Second was the power of the Pope and the infallibility that the Pope was claiming. And the third was the church's intransigence to any change and rectifying of the obvious corruptions that he saw. Therefore, in a move to begin a discussion of these issues, Martin Luther posted 95 theses. These are 95 discussion points, and he posted them on the church at the chapel at Wittenberg University. This occurred in the year 1517. The 95 theses were not intended to be a break from the church. They were intended to initiate discussions, debates perhaps, but they were picked up by the press in Germany, published widely, both in German and in Latin. And with that, a groundswell began. The German people started to question whether or not their needs were being taken care of properly by the Catholic Church. In particular, there was the issue of indulgences. The Catholic Church had a man who was going through Germany selling the indulgences for the building of St. Peter's. This man, named Tetzel, was very successful, but with Martin Luther's statements, these 95 Theses, Tetzel's work dropped to zero practically. He was unable to get people to buy the indulgences, and therefore he became very angry. He put pressure on the church to put pressure on Martin Luther, and Martin Luther became defiant. He said, "No, I won't change my ideas." And he was forced into an inquiry by officials from the church. He defied them. There were a series of debates. He was defiant in those debates. And finally, that resulted in excommunication by the Pope. One of the major reasons for all of this defiance on the part of Martin Luther is that he could sense a groundswell of support among the people of Germany. The reason is that the printing press, having been invented just a couple of generations previous, was in full power. People in Germany had become literate. They were hungry for information of all kinds. And Martin Luther had published many of his arguments in pamphlets, and they were very, very popular. Here's a video that talks about the power of the press and discusses what was done for Martin Luther, or done to Martin Luther, to try and correct some of his defiant ways.
But as Leo was raising the stakes in Rome, Luther was discovering that he had a new and powerful weapon on his side. Luther had watched as the printers had spread his 95 Theses across Germany. And he had realized that their presses could offer him a vast new audience. Luther penned a new text, an address to the Christian nobility of the German nation. With this little pamphlet, Luther would strike a devastating blow at both Pope and Church. His masterstroke was to direct it not at the clerics and clergy, but at the secular rulers of Germany. In Luther's time, Germany was a patchwork of tiny provinces. Each province was governed by its own local ruler, but they were also held under the overall dominion of the Holy Roman Empire. And individually, these fragmented states did not have the strength to stand up to Rome's ever-increasing financial demands. Luther painted a vivid picture of the financial drain that was Rome.
German money, in violation of nature, flies over the Alps.
Luther, in no uncertain terms, was now arguing that the powers of Germany should stand up to Rome and the Pope.
It seems to me that the only remedy remaining is for the emperor, the kings and princes to gird themselves with force of arms to attack these pests of the world and fight them, not with words, but with steel.
It was a truly radical agenda. Luther was arguing that not just the clergy, but every German had a stake in their church.
To use modern ways of speaking, we're talking here about the democratization of religion.
But Luther's revolutionary work would have a far more immediate consequence. It would now save him from being handed over to the church for trial and execution. The region of Saxony where Luther lived was ruled by a man named Frederick the Wise. It was Frederick who had founded the University of Wittenberg, where Luther now taught. Frederick began to quietly protect this loudmouth theologian that lay under his rule, refusing to simply hand him over to the agents of the Pope. Frederick had also quickly recognized the implications of Luther's latest work. But the address to the Christian nobility was attracting attention in even higher circles. In 1520, Frederick received a visit from the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles had only just come to power, but he was already finding Luther a concern.
The end result was that Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who was also the King of Austria, the King of Spain, and the King of the Lowlands, came to Germany and held a one-day, it's called a one-day court, it's called the Diet, and he held it in the city of Worms in Germany, and he called Martin Luther to him. Martin Luther was still defiant, even in front of the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles wanted to smooth it over and take care of the problem and smooth things down so the German people were not in revolt. Martin Luther would not recant, would not take back what he had said. And in fact, he said, "Unless I am proved wrong by Scripture or by evident reason, then I am a prisoner in conscience to the Word of God. I cannot retract, and I will not retract. To go against the conscience is neither safe nor right. God help me, amen." Martin Luther left. He was in danger of being captured and killed. But what actually happened is that the elector of the area that he was in, Saxony, protected him. The Prince of Saxony protected him. And Martin Luther went into hiding. There in hiding, he was able to translate the Bible into German, a very fine translation. He, over the years, decided that it would be wise to make a complete break with the Catholic Church, which he did. He was convinced by others that he should form a new church and that they called it the Lutheran Church, which he did. And in his personal life, he fell in love with a nun and he married her. It was a marriage of happiness and joy for the large part. We believe that they were truly happy together. And when all of that was done, the Lutheran Church formed, people started to join the Lutheran Church, and a permanent break with the Catholic Church had been made. The Catholics did not just sit back and take it. They began to put pressure on these people who had become Lutherans and try and convert them back. They made several changes. These changes are called the Counter-Reformation. Let's talk now for a moment about what were the key elements of the Counter-Reformation. A new monastic order was formed, and they were called the Jesuits. They viewed themselves as soldiers of Christ. They reported directly to the Pope. Their order was directly under the Pope's supervision, and their main job was to go out and reconvert the wayward Protestants back to the Catholic faith. In addition to that, of course, they also began conversion of non-Catholics, that is, heathens, non-Christians, into the Christian faith as well. The Jesuits were very powerful, and they were quite successful, not only in their efforts to convert non-Christians, but in retaining the Catholic membership in most of the places where the people had stayed Catholic. They did not switch over and become Protestants after the Jesuits were formed. So they were at least successful in maintaining the membership of the Catholic Church. In addition to that, the Catholic Church began a series of reforms. It was called the Council of Trent, meeting in the city of Trent in Italy. And over about 20 years, a series of councils were held, and many reforms were made in the Catholic Church. But for the Lutherans, it was too little, too late. There was a reinitiation of the Inquisition. Inquisition is a church trial where a bishop of the church is given the authority to administer church laws, and he's given authority that if he needs to, he can have people killed, usually by burning, occasionally by strangulation or some other method. They could also torture people, and of course they could put them in jail. The Inquisition was quite powerful during this period of time, and that may have had a result of reducing the number of people who fled to Protestantism after the initial burst with Luther's success. A question that you might ask: should a church attempt to control the thinking and practices of its members as the Catholic Church was doing at this time? Most people would agree that a church should try and maintain some order, some semblance of uniformity in its doctrine and practices. I think very few would say that the church should be given the authority to kill people, but nevertheless there should be some way that a church has of maintaining order. The Counter-Reformation had some scholars, and one of the men who spoke out against Luther said, "Men must be changed by religion, not religion by men." And therefore he is against Luther's attempt to change the church. Nevertheless, because of Luther's reforms or calls for reform, the Catholic Church did change, and it became less corrupt because of the Reformation. Luther was not the only person to break from the Catholic Church. At the same time as Luther, there was a man in Switzerland whose name was Zwingli. Zwingli had some concepts of doctrine that were very similar to Luther, and a few that were a little bit different. But in general, these men worked in concert, although not as partnerships. They were friendly, but they kept their distance because of some of the disagreements. Zwingli believed that there should be an armed rebellion against the Catholic Church and against the Catholic leaders in Switzerland. And in the city of Zurich, he formed an army, and they attempted to break free from the Catholic Church and from the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. Zwingli died in battle, and with his death, his movement lost a lot of its impetus. Nevertheless, the group that he began, called Anabaptists, have some residues even to this day. The Mennonites and the Amish are two of the groups that descended from the group begun by Zwingli. Also in Switzerland, but about a half a generation later, was a Frenchman who came to Switzerland because he was being persecuted in France. and his name was John Calvin. He went to French-speaking Geneva, and there he set up a school and eventually set up a government in the city that followed his teachings. He disagreed with Luther on several points of doctrine, Calvin being very, very strict in his feelings about adherence to the laws that he set up. There were times when the people of Geneva were angry, and they actually at one point threw Calvin out of the city. But after a few years, he was invited to return because the city fathers in Geneva felt that he would calm down the divisions that had occurred when he left. John Calvin's church is sometimes called the Presbyterian Church, or sometimes given the name of a country that adopted his teachings. For instance, the Scottish Church is a Calvinist church, and so is the Dutch Reformed Church, a Calvinist church. But here in the United States, when we speak of a Calvinist church, we usually are talking about the Presbyterian faith. Well, let's talk about what happened in France during the time of the Reformation. We know what happened in Germany. Northern Germany became Protestant, Lutheran. Scandinavia mostly became Protestant, Lutheran. But France was an area where there were two groups. The Catholic Church remained very, very powerful, but Calvinist groups had sprung up. They were called the Huguenots. And we'll talk about the conflicts between the Catholic Church and the royalty and those who were dissenting, called Huguenots. Let's go back to the time of Francis I, about the year 1500. Francis I was a very powerful king, and he would not allow any dissent. Any kind of religious discussion was suppressed, and it was during that time that the Huguenots were unable to really grow very quickly because of his strong influence. When Francis I died, his son, Henry II, became the king, and Henry II married one of the Medici family, Catherine de' Medici. The marriage of Henry and Catherine de' Medici was not a happy one. It began okay, and Henry had a beautiful palace built for Catherine called Chenonceau. Here we see a picture of it. But after a few years, Henry decided that he wanted his mistress to live in this beautiful palace. And so Diane de Poitiers moved in, and Catherine de' Medici was forced to go to another place. Catherine was not happy. Eventually, Henry died, and Catherine had 3 sons, each of whom she dominated very, very strongly. The first son, therefore the next king, was named Francis II. He is an interesting person. He was a young man when he became king, and he married Mary, Queen of Scots. We'll talk more about her in a few moments. When Mary saw Chenonceau, she loved it, and therefore she pushed Diane de Poitiers out. Catherine de' Medici had tried to take it over again, but she was now the mother of the king and not the wife of the king, and therefore Mary, Queen of Scots, was able to move into Chenonceau. My wife is of Scottish ancestry, and one time when we were in Chenonceau, we were listening to a lecture from one of the guides, and the guide mentioned that there were graffiti on the walls from the guards, that is the Scottish guards that Mary brought with her. And in fact, she said, if you look here on this wall, and she pointed to the wall, there is a plastic sheet, and under the plastic sheet you can see the graffiti. And I looked, and there was a name, George McKean, which my wife was excited about because that's her last name, McKean. And therefore, we saw the evidence of the Scottish guards of Mary, Queen of Scots, when she was married to Francis II. But Francis died before any children were born to the couple, and therefore, when a king dies without any children, the next in line would be the king's brother. In this case, that would be Charles IX. Charles, like his father, or like his brother, was dominated by their mother, Catherine de' Medici. And Catherine was a vigorous opponent of the Huguenots, of the Protestants in France. And therefore, at a particular time, there was a gathering of Huguenots for a marriage, and Catherine convinced Charles that on that day, the Huguenots should be killed. There was a massacre begun. It happened to be called St. Bartholomew's Day, and so it's the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and thousands of Huguenots, first in Paris and then all over France, were slaughtered on that day because Catherine and Charles wanted to suppress any Protestant movement. Eventually, Charles died and his brother became king, Henry III, but Henry III also died without any children. When that happened, the dynasty of France, the ruling dynasty, came to an end. That dynasty was called the Valois dynasty. It had been started in the 1300s when the Capetian dynasty also encountered a succession problem. Now we see the Valois at an end, and so a new king must be chosen. The king that they chose was Henry of Navarre. Navarre is a small kingdom that existed in those days in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. What's interesting is that Henry of Navarre was a Protestant, and having just killed all of these Protestants, the people of France felt that perhaps they should have a Catholic king, and nevertheless, Henry was the one who was most likely to be king, and so they offered the kingship to him if he would convert to be a Catholic. And Henry reportedly said, the kingship of France is worth a mass, meaning I will attend Mass, I will convert to Catholicism, and he did so. He began what is called the Bourbon dynasty of France. But as soon as he became king, he gave an edict called the Edict of Nantes, and that edict is an edict of religious toleration. All Protestants were protected in France during the time of Henry IV, up until the time of Louis XIV, when he revoked the Edict of Toleration. Well, now we can take a look at the map and see the division of Protestant versus Catholic in Europe. We can see that Spain, France, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and Lithuania are all part of the Catholic regime, also including Ireland. Northern Europe, especially Scandinavia and northern Germany, are Lutheran. Then there are Calvinist areas in Switzerland, Netherlands, and Scotland. And we can see that England is, of course, Anglican, or Church of England. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. Thank you very much.